evening, everybody. I want to again welcome you all to the AWARE keynote address of this evening. Fred Jewett, the Dean of the College, will be doing the introduction of our keynote speaker. But first, I wanted to do a couple of housekeeping things. Let you know that we have a week full of programs that are very exciting and that I think will be very enriching to us all. And I want to invite you to take programs from the table if you need some and bring to your offices or your rooms. I also want to say that I'm going to take the liberty as the coordinator of this program to dedicate this AWARE Week to the memory of someone whose life in the Harvard community, I think, exemplifies what we all want to do here as members of this community, and that is to use our lives to enrich other lives and therefore to enrich the community. And the person I want to dedicate this week to is to Mac Davis, who was a mentor to me, who was a good friend, and who, as a person of color, I think was acutely aware of his persona here and how to use that to mentor other people of color. And he mentored me, and I think in mentoring me, he allowed me to give other people, not just people of color, some of his spirit and some of what he gave to me, and also to what he's given to a lot of people in this community. So I hope that his spirit is here with us, and I think that the spirit of AWARE is one of really taking the opportunities to learn from one another and to grow from one another. And I hope that you join not just this evening, but all the AWARE events of the week and all the other events that you have seen occurring around the issues of race relations on campus, some of the Education for Action, Harvard Foundation, and other individual events that are happening in the community that are really basically efforts from the community to help us grow together and grow with one another. So I welcome you here tonight. I thank you for being here tonight, and I hope that you enjoy all those other efforts. Thank you. And I'm going to introduce now Dean Jewett.
Thank you very much, Hilda, and it's a great pleasure for me tonight to welcome you all to this opening keynote address of the AWARE Week. I hope that many of you, as Hilda said, will participate in some of the other programs, and I want to particularly call your attention to the forum on Friday where issues of free speech will be talked. I think we have a wonderful panel together, including a moderator by our distinguished professor of government here, and I think it should be a wonderful occasion. Before introducing today's speaker, I'd just like to make a few comments about the reasons, I think, why we have some of the activities that are characterized in AWARE Week, because I think at times there is a misunderstanding of what AWARE is trying to do. I think, in fact, we're not trying in any way to be unusually critical of our community or the communities around us, but really to draw together, to try, in fact, to work together to promote a better atmosphere of understanding. The goal of a AWARE program should be to draw the university community closer together in cooperative efforts to promote a society free of discrimination and characterized by respect and understanding for people of all races and nationalities. The purpose of AWARE is not and should not be primarily an exercise of pointing fingers at examples of racism here at Harvard. Indeed, I think I can say with some pride that the atmosphere at Harvard is probably well above average in terms of its tolerance and respect for racial and ethnic pluralism. On the other hand, even here in a very liberal community, there can be occasions where discrimination may exist, either in an overt form or more often unintentionally. A university really should be a place which teaches people to understand the problems in the world around them and to try and how to develop solutions to these problems. Perhaps what we at Harvard and other colleges and universities can best do is to try to promote a free and open dialogue of views which may help us to understand the causes of racism in society at large, and how to use education as a tool to try to eliminate these causes. In such efforts, we must always remember that racism and bigotry are not simple issues to understand. Discrimination may occur in some circumstances against all races and religions. While in a community like Boston, it may be directed primarily against people of color, there are other communities and situations where the minority could be a religious group or any group who hold beliefs or traditions opposed or feared by the local majority. We thus cannot focus exclusively on issues of black against white or Muslim versus Jew. Rather, we should try to reach people of all races and religions and nationalities, helping them to understand better their own potential for bias and insensitivity so that they can work to overcome them. AWARE should try to highlight what students of diverse backgrounds share in common as members of the Harvard community so that all can live and work here free from prejudice and discrimination and supported by the respect of their classmates and the entire community. If AWARE can help us to achieve these positive goals, it will more than have met our fondest expectations. We're fortunate this evening to have a very distinguished keynoter, Dr. Reginald Wilson. Dr. Wilson was named Senior Scholar of the American Council on Education in October 1988. He joined the Council as Director of the Office of Minority Concerns on October 1, 1981. Prior to that appointment, he was for nearly 10 years President of Wayne County Community College in Detroit. Other higher education career positions he has held have been Dean, Director of Test Development and Research, Director of Black Studies, and Director of Upward Bound. He was a psychologist in the Detroit Public Schools prior to that. Dr. Wilson has taught graduate courses in psychology and Black Studies at Wayne State, the University of Detroit, Oakland University, and the University of Michigan. He is co-author of Human Development in the Urban Community, the editor of Race and Equity in Higher Education, and the author of Civil Liberties in the U.S. He's on the editorial board of the American Journal of Education and the Urban Review. Dr. Wilson received his PhD in clinical psychology from Wayne State University. He's licensed as a psychologist in Michigan and in Washington, D.C., and does volunteer work with the homeless. He was honored as a distinguished alumnus of Wayne State University in 1980 and as a recipient of the Anthony Wayne Award and the Distinguished Service Medal of the City of Detroit. We are very privileged to have Dr. Wilson with us tonight, and the title of his talk is The Complexity of Modern Racism, Perspective for Change in the 21st Century. Dr. Wilson.
Thank you very much. Perhaps I should ask, are there any questions? I think you characterized most of the issues that we're going to be discussing this evening and put them in the proper framework. I don't know if these front seats are reserved for the family of the deceased or anyway. Before I begin, maybe I should make a comment about the American Council on Education. Since I've been here this afternoon, at least 5 people have asked me what ACE is, and so it might be well to tell you just a little bit about the American Council. ACE was formed in 1918 during the Great War in order to bring the higher education community together to speak with one voice in the war effort, and it's been trying to do that ever since. We represent all of the colleges and universities in the country and the other higher education associations, and we try to bring them together to speak with one voice for lobbying of Congress, for speaking next year to the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. And in 1981, we received a grant from the Ford Foundation to establish an office to deal with minority issues in higher education because there did not exist one representing the higher education community in Washington, D.C. And I was invited to establish that office. Since that time, we've been publishing on a yearly basis an annual status report of minorities in higher education and have been holding conferences, most recently last month in San Francisco to deal with the national issues confronting minorities in higher education. Since that time, I have been asked to assume the position of senior scholar in order to spend more time consulting with colleges and universities on this issue and delegating some of the authority for the other work to other staff. In addition to that, it gives me an opportunity to do more writing on this issue and a little more research. So given that background, the fact that ACE does represent the constituency of higher education, your president is a former chair of our board, and Mr. Bach is still very active in American Council on Education activities. Now, with regard to the topic, the complexities of modern racism, perspectives for change in the 21st century, let me begin by quoting from a report which will be published later this month. The second section of the report reads as follows. There can be no doubt in the traditions of the United States, racism and fear of different people have been shameful stains. Americans living today can recall a time when mob violence, beatings, even the lynching of black citizens were part of American life. When black Americans raise the specter of racism, therefore, they stand on very solid ground. It played itself out in business, in higher education, in athletics, in entertainment, and in civil liberties. The legal basis of discrimination is now largely a thing of the past, but its institutional effects remain. Despite the national effort to root out racism, much of American culture assumes a white, in fact, a European view of the world, and many minorities have been left stranded outside of the mainstream of American life. These words are not the rantings of some soft-headed liberals or complaining minorities, but are part of a report to be published this month by the Business Higher Education Forum. And the report, entitled Minority Life in the United States, will bear the signatures of such hard-headed realists as John J. Phelan, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of the New York Stock Exchange, C.R. Weaver, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of the Clorox Company, Winston R. Hindle, Senior Vice President of Digital Equipment Corporation, the Reverend Edward A. Malloy, President of the University of Notre Dame, David P. Gardner, President of the University of California, and 13 other CEOs and heads of Fortune 500 corporations. Certainly the question must be asked, what has compelled these hard-headed American leaders to speak so clearly and forcefully concerning the devastating consequences of racism today in American society on its minority citizens? The answer is equally clear and forceful. They have recognized that the blight of racism is not, in their own words, their problem, meaning the problems of the minority community, but our problem. They go on to say, unless we resolve them, our economy and its corporations, universities, and school systems, communities, and families will pay the price of continued failure. Continued economic success and a rising standard of living depend on making the best use of all of the young people in our society. These corporate leaders are quite candidly looking at the bottom line. If the United States is to remain a leading nation, it cannot do so if a third of its citizens are undereducated and underemployed, in large measure due to the societal restrictions of institutional racism. Moreover, these corporate leaders are looking at demographic realities. By the year 2000, minorities will be 1/3 of the American population and will continue to be the fastest growing segment well into the 21st century. And finally, these corporate leaders are looking with alarm at the declining position of minorities in American society in recent years. Fact, there are more American Indians, Hispanics, and blacks below the poverty line today than there were 10 years ago. Fact, Hispanic unemployment is about 50% higher than the rate for whites, and black unemployment is 2.5 times as high. Fact, the gap in life expectancy between blacks and whites has grown worse for blacks since 1984. Fact, infant mortality for blacks has grown worse in the past 10 years. Fact, despite increasing high school graduation rates for both blacks and Hispanics, both groups' proportional enrollment in higher education has sharply declined since 1976. Corporate leaders looking at these alarming statistics recognize that despite the progress of the 1960s and 70s, the always precarious position of minorities has seriously declined in the 1980s. And these leaders, by issuing their report, have indicated their strong determination to do something about it. Their problem will be convincing their fellow white Americans that there is a problem, that they are part of the problem, and that they too must do something about it. That task will not be an easy one. The German philosopher Hegel pointed out in 1820 that philosophy has been of little use in the interpretation of events until the forces which created them have almost run their full course. Hegel wrote, "The owl of Minerva begins its height when dusk is falling." Hegel's point that wisdom enters the human condition only when it is almost dark helps explain why it takes so long for people and public policy to respond to changing conditions. We have such a crisis now, but we have neither the aroused perception of the white majority or the mobilization of public policy to address it. W.E.B. Du Bois, the eminent black sociologist and a graduate of this institution, wrote prophetically in 1906 that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men. The 21st century promises to continue to see the color line as the major societal problem. We must ask ourselves the question, why is racism so persistent? Why does it maintain itself so continuously despite occasional waxing and waning throughout our history? The answer is varied and complex. However, certain observations can be made quite directly and forthrightly. One reason racism persists is because people benefit from it. When resources are distributed unequally, people who get less do less well than those who get more. For example, in public schools, attended by blacks and Hispanics, have been systematically underfunded in comparison to schools attended by white children. They have the least prepared teachers, the least instructional equipment, and the worst physical plant. And then we ask, why don't those people do well in school? In 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court declared that segregated schools were inherently unequal and ordered them to be desegregated in the famous Brown versus Board of Education decision. 35 years later, whites have fled to the suburbs, and urban school systems are more segregated now than they were before Brown, and they continue to be underfunded, poorly staffed, and lacking in educational achievement. In the landmark Jenkins case of this year, the state court found the schools of Kansas City to be, in the judge's words, an abomination. The judge ordered the city to pass a tax increase to improve the schools. Although the majority of the students were black, the majority of the voters were white. They refused to pass the tax increase. The judge then ordered the city to impose a tax increase. That critical case is now on appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. Voters without children in these schools did not see it in their self-interest to tax themselves for schools from which they perceived no benefit. The ruling in this case will have far-reaching consequences for the potential of equalizing the funding of schools, which continue to be racially segregated and with little likelihood that they will ever be desegregated. Another reason racism persists is because society rationalizes the circumstances of minorities in order to convince itself that the reason those people are in that condition is due to some defect in them, a flaw in their character, a lack of discipline, and indeed perhaps even genetically inferior. Eminent university scholars throughout American history, and in Europe as well for that matter, have provided the intellectual and so-called scientific justifications for status inequalities as due to the social and intellectual inferiority of those at the bottom of the status ladder. In recent times, Professors Arthur Jensen, William Shockley, and also scholars at this esteemed institution have contributed to that disreputable enterprise. A third reason racism persists is because we have placed discussion of the topic outside the realm of polite discourse. Yes, we have problems, but to describe our society as racist is almost, well, un-American. After all, racism as it was practiced in the 1930s and 40s was the lynching of blacks, segregated schools, and policemen beating black civil rights demonstrators. It was evil men doing despicable things. Since we don't do that anymore, we can't be racist. We just have some problems. And most of those problems have to do with minorities not lifting themselves up by their bootstraps. However, that analysis fails to recognize that racism is systemic and institutionalized. By that is meant that the institutions of society, their beliefs, rules, and operating procedures are such that they systematically favor the dominant group, and that group has the power to maintain that disparate treatment. For example, the ACLU, in attempting to overturn the death penalty in the U.S., presented overwhelming statistical evidence to demonstrate that blacks are disproportionately sentenced to die compared to whites, thus depriving them of their 14th Amendment rights to equal protection of the laws. The Supreme Court looked at the evidence and said, yes, you're right, but we can't do anything about that. We can only deal with discrimination in individual cases of the death penalty. Therefore, they left the death penalty intact and the rights of blacks abrogated. In this context, it should be mentioned that in the history of this country, no white man has ever been executed for killing a black person. Racism does not require evil men for it to function. All it requires is that we get up in the morning, go about our business as usual, and go to bed at night. And institutional racism will function quite well. In order to eliminate racism, we must change what we do in institutions and as a society. And first, we must believe that that change is good for all of us. One trivial example. Voter registration in New York City is only available at relatively inaccessible city offices. In order to register, poor and minority people must travel long distances and even sometimes take off work to register to vote. Registration could just as easily be offered in schools and churches in the communities, but that would increase the voting power of minorities, and it has not been in the interest of the powers that be to have that happen. Such disparate, systematic treatment, multiplied 1,000-fold, maintains some groups in power while disenfranchising others without consciously having to commit evil acts. William Raspberry, in his Washington Post column this morning, asked rhetorically in speaking about racism, what is to be done about the problem? He goes on to say, it calls for greater federal commitment to fair employment, more fairness from lending institutions, and the elimination of white prejudice generally. With all due respect that you have to end a newspaper column in about 2,000 words, Mr. Raspberry's solution is awesomely simplistic. You cannot end white prejudice by issuing a presidential executive order tomorrow. Such behaviors are deeply embedded in our culture, in our belief systems, and in the social practices and institutions of white society. It is a long-term and complex process. It involves both changing behavior and changing values. A fourth reason racism persists is that people do not like to think ill of themselves. Therefore, they allow themselves to believe that societal circumstances are much better than they are in order that they may be satisfied with the status quo. For example, a recent 1989 poll by the Washington Post and ABC News asked whites and blacks their perceptions of discrimination in various categories such as housing and wages. Less than 20% of whites felt there was discrimination in housing. while nearly 60% of blacks felt so. Yet a recent study revealed that when renters were seeking housing, 70% were steered by real estate agents to areas where they were in the racial majority. And when homeowners were seeking housing, 90% were steered to where they were in the racial majority. With respect to wages, only 18% of whites felt there was discrimination in wages, while 60% of blacks felt so. A study by the Labor Department, however, found that the average wages of white high school dropouts equaled or exceeded those of black high school graduates, and this disparity was consistent up the educational and occupational scale. It is not just that the black perceptions in the survey were more accurately reflective of reality than the white, but as the Business Higher Education Forum candidly states in its report, clearly the vast majority of white Americans have little appreciation of the profound suspicion with which many black citizens view the larger institutions in American life, and the tenuous connection between minority citizens and those institutions. Finally, I wish to spend my last few moments discussing the problem of bigotry on college campuses, which should be of particular concern to this audience. Suffice it to say that reported incidents continue apace right up to this very day. Just glancing at the Chronicle of Higher Education for the past few weeks corroborates their steady continuance. At Brooklyn College on October 11th, 3 Jewish students were beaten severely after anti-Semitic remarks were made to them. At the University of Mississippi, 5 fraternity members tied up 2 of their pledges naked and painted racial slurs on their body and abandoned them on the campus of Rusk College, a nearby predominantly black institution. A fraternity at Penn State gave a Rosh Hashanah party on the first night of the Jewish New Year that was obviously anti-Semitic in nature. In New York, some skinheads attacked some students they assumed were homosexual. And 7 incidents of harassment aimed at Jews, Asians, blacks, and homosexuals have been reported at the University of Connecticut in just the past 2 months since school started there. And on it goes. There is a lesson to be learned here. Those who hate do not discriminate. The National Institute Against Prejudice and Violence in Baltimore recorded some 256 incidents of racially motivated violence on campuses during the past 3 years. And similar lists have been compiled by the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, the Community Relations Service of the U.S. Justice Department, and the Anti-Defamation League. The U.S. Congress is considering the establishment of a hate crime statistic unit, and I testified this spring before the House Judiciary Committee, several of whose members have sponsored legislation to establish that unit. If it is approved, that unit would look at hate crime throughout society, and properly so, since I think few would argue that what is occurring on campuses is a microcosm of the larger increase in manifestations of bigotry in the greater society. It is clear that there is a problem of increased bigotry in society and that that problem is reflected on college and university campuses. A number of commentators have attempted to discern underlying causes, and it would be less than accurate to say that there is total consensus among them. Nevertheless, for purposes of this symposium, I will describe some of the themes running through explanatory material that I've encountered, while freely indicating my own biases in terms of how useful these various conjectures are. You will have equal time during the discussion period to respond. On the macro level, our society has gone through substantial changes in the past 30 to 35 years that I believe have much to do with the racial dynamics we are now witnessing. Let me just recite a few of the landmarks of the earlier years prior to the current period. Certainly the Brown decision in 1954, desegregating public schools, heralded a new era of race relations in this country. In 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus. That was followed in 1960 by the black student sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina, which initiated both the American student movement and the more activist phase of the civil rights movement. In 1964, beginning with the Berkeley free speech demonstrations, white students also became an active force for social justice. The Supreme Court outlawed segregated buses in 1956, and shortly thereafter, all segregated facilities were declared illegal. The first Civil Rights Act since the Civil War was passed in 1964. John Kennedy's and Lyndon Johnson's New Frontier and Great Society were in full force. The Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, and President Lyndon Johnson issued Executive Order 11246, establishing affirmative action programs. There was, for approximately 2 decades, from 1954 to 1976, a national consensus on racial progress and social justice that included not only a substantial plurality of the American people, but the Congress, the presidents, and the Supreme Court as well. Those of us who lived through that period felt we could only go forward, that it was impossible to regress. We were wrong. Just last week, I read an article in the Village Voice which gave me a glimmer of what transpired between those 2 decades and today. The reporter was interviewing an ardent supporter of David Duke, the Ku Klux Klansman recently elected to the Louisiana state legislature. The gentleman very passionately declared that he knew in the past that something was wrong in this country, and that was that no one was concerned about him. He happened to be a lower middle class white male. And that here, finally, after all these years, someone was saying what he felt and thought and was making it respectable to say in public. There is no doubt that bigotry did not disappear in this country after 1954, but at the risk of oversimplification, there did develop a national consensus, a shared community, if you will, of a substantial plurality of the population dedicated to putting our long history of bigotry, racism, and legally sanctioned discrimination behind us. The economy was expanding, and a sense of inclusion permeated the nation. The preponderance of the media was devoted to documenting that movement to inclusion, while the voices of bigotry were momentarily muted. The ascendancy of Ronald Reagan to the presidency, in the words of that Louisiana gentleman, allowed someone to say what he felt and thought and made it respectable to say in public. Here was the nation's leader who said publicly he was against transportation for school desegregation, which he called forced busing, who was against affirmative action, which he called reverse discrimination, who was for tax exemptions for segregated schools, who was opposed to higher education desegregation programs, and who was for cutting federal funds for social programs that benefited the poor. Here was a president who appointed enough Supreme Court justices to make a solid conservative majority that in one court term has set back more civil rights progress than was achieved in the past decade. But in the decade of the 1980s, unlike the 1960s, there was no national progressive consensus. There was no shared community protesting objection to this presidential bigotry, which then allowed Mr. Reagan's vocal supporters to take center stage for the past 8 years and to flourish. Indeed, the community which once shared a progressive agenda was more at war within itself than united against what was previously the common enemy. An era in which the L word, liberal, is a badge of shame, and in which one apologizes for membership in the American Civil Liberties Union is one in which progressives are in total disarray. Professor Warren Miller of Arizona State University, in analyzing voter trends in 1988, found that 38% of voters called themselves conservative, versus 17% who said they were liberals. Professor Miller said this was the largest margin we've witnessed in recent years. The shift is politically significant because it occurred not only among relatively new voters, but since 1984 among the better educated and older voters. These changes are not likely to disappear with the disappearance of Mr. Bush, Professor Miller added. Similarly, on college campuses, we find a breakdown of community that once coalesced around common values. In the American Council on Education Journal, Educational Record, we noted, in the 1960s, the emerging counterculture created new bonds between once divided students. Confronting a hostile world, young people lowered the barriers among themselves. Thus, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner could join together to struggle for black voting rights in Mississippi and to be martyred together in that struggle. I wonder how many of you even know who those three men were. And opposition to the Vietnam War, while dividing society, united many students across race and ethnic lines. But with the decline of material resources since the 1970s and the incredible escalation of tuition and college costs, the white students of the 1980s, terrified that they might fail to attain the material well-being of their parents, brought to the campuses their conservatism, their sense of entitlement, and their hostility to classmates vying for places in the economic and social order. And the students of color of the 1980s brought their racial isolation, their sense of being under siege, and their sense of outrage at both perceived and actual acts of discrimination and racial harassment. Despite being in closer contact than they ever had been before, or probably will be again, people of color and whites on campus have sharply different views on both the nature and intensity of racial problems. A Washington Post ABC News poll on October the 25th found that blacks reported more discrimination today in housing and education than 8 years ago, although whites felt minority access was improving. Independent research confirms the correctness of the black view. The Center for Higher Education at Illinois State University survey of blacks on campus reported that blacks perceive the racial climate to worsen as they persist through the system rather than to improve. Ernest Boyer reports in a study that was released last month that there has been a sharp decline in the quality of life on campus and a breakdown in the sense of community. Groups that were formerly allies and consensus on most value issues now find themselves estranged and thus can develop little common cause on issues of bigotry that oppress all of them. Black professors are supportive of affirmative action. They find many white liberal professors opposed. Blacks invite Louis Farrakhan, a bigot, to campus, and Jews go crazy. Jews invite Mayor Kahana, a bigot, to campus, and blacks go crazy. Gays and lesbians do not have strong coalitions with other oppressed groups, and thus their oppression is seen as different. Arab students are given little political legitimacy by hardly any group, and therefore their oppression is ignored by nearly all other groups who decry their own pain as being unique and special. Few ethnic groups support each other's causes. Meanwhile, the forces of bigotry are relatively united, and they have won numerous battles, if not perhaps the war. They have a kind and gentle president, a reactionary Supreme Court, and a cowardly and ineffectual Congress. On campus, Alan Bloom's Closing of the American Mind becomes an instant bestseller and strikes a chord of empathy in many who agree with his quaint phrase, the barbarians are at the gate. Those various groups who profess a progressive agenda have no common sense of community among themselves, and thus they are powerless except in a few isolated and exemplary instances to stem the increasing tide of bigotry. Academic leadership on most campuses attempts the quick fix, such as the crude suppression of free speech, rather than tackle the more difficult task of curricular reform and the teaching of the values of democracy, cultural diversity, and the celebration of differences. On June 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of this year, I was in Tiananmen Square in Beijing in the People's Republic of China, bearing witness with the students in their pro-democracy struggle. As you know, that movement was crushed on June the 4th. But what intrigued me about the students was their passionate appropriation of the ideas of Jefferson and Paine as they tried to understand concepts of democracy and pluralism and freedom of expression. and as they demanded that their leaders sign the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It is somewhat disquieting, as you can understand, that a recent poll shows that nearly 50% of American college seniors are ignorant of the Emancipation Proclamation, the Magna Carta, and other similar documents elaborating our freedoms and values. Little wonder that the baser instincts of students so frequently surface on the campuses of our so-called institutions of higher learning. The American Council on Education proposes that our vision of community should value diversity within a set of common goals. Ideally distinct communities on campus should be woven together in that rich tapestry we call campus community. We are far indeed from that ideal, and I do not see us getting there very soon unless we transcend our differences, unite around our common oppression, and strive to achieve that vision of community. That is unlikely to happen soon, but I hope to be proven wrong. The necessity for change is a philosophical charge directed to each one of us. It is a challenge to our values, to our beliefs, and to our perceptions of what a just society should look like. For our corporate leaders, it is an issue of the bottom line. We must end racism or decline as a world power. For you, as educated adults and future leaders, it must be more than that. Material incentives are insufficient. We must ask ourselves what kind of society we want to have in the 21st century and begin to build it today. We are each responsible for that destiny. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. We will now open the floor for question and answer. There are microphones at each side of the room. Please come forward to your questions, with your questions.
Thank you very much. As you visit college campuses and universities, could you, drawing upon your experiences, make some suggestions as to how we, in these supposed model communities, might begin to move towards the future that you have modest hopes that we can move towards, but have also a great deal of skepticism? Are there some pointers that you could give to us as to how to work towards that kind of more inclusive community?
Yes, there are. One thing, it seems to me, is it's important to find out what is going on your campuses. Just up the street from here, President Paul Gray at MIT felt that there was a positive and genuine sense of community there, and he asked Dean of Students Shirley McVeigh to conduct a survey, and I think was quite surprised to find a sense of strong alienation on the part of minority students on the MIT campus. But that was sufficient to energize President Gray to begin to institute a number of measures to enhance the community spirit and the cohesiveness of the MIT community as a result of that survey. Shirley McVeigh has subsequently received a major grant from the Carnegie Foundation to establish a national program that I've been participating in with her called Quality Education for Minorities. And that program is bringing together people from all over the country to talk about ways in which we can enhance minority participation, not just at the university level, but from kindergarten to graduate school. And they will be publishing, the QEM project as it's called, will be publishing some of its findings during the past 2 years that it's been studying this coming spring. And I would certainly see that document as being one having many kinds of programs and strategies that institutions can establish to help do exactly what you're asking. Also, the American Council on Education published a document on January the 1st of this year, a book called Minorities on Campus. and it does include a number of specific strategies and recommendations on how campuses can improve the climate, the interaction of students, the harmony with the environment, and so forth. We in fact call it our cookbook because we are talking not theoretically, we're talking about actual examples of programs that work, and we cite institutions where these programs are successfully being practiced. We identify a contact person, their phone numbers in the handbook. We anticipate that people will be using this in a very direct kind of way. The conference that we sponsored in San Francisco November the 5th through the 7th was a working session of representatives from campuses all over the country. There were 700 people out there, and we turned away over 100 people because we just could not accommodate them. We'll be repeating that same conference in the Midwest because there's so much demand for people saying, what can we do about this, just as you're asking. And at that conference we spent 3 days saying, these are things that you can do, and here is where they're working. One of the things that we find most useful, and I was very pleased to hear from Hilda that you're working with RAs and the dormitories and training race relations. Yes, you're way ahead of the game in that sense, because working directly in dormitory or residential life with students is exactly the kind of thing that we are telling people in residential institutions needs to be done. And some of the more successful programs are going on in residential life, because that's where some of the greatest interaction with students is occurring. So I was very pleased to hear about that. But I would strongly urge that the Handbook Minorities on Campus from ACE as one kind of document. We have distributed over 20,000 copies to various campuses around the country. And indeed, the Harvard Graduate School ordered 300 copies, so there are a couple floating around campus. Yeah.
I just want to say that I thought that Dr. Wilson's talk was a very powerful one, and that sometimes that kind of very powerful and almost poignant kind of talk carries a lot of weight with it that silences us for a minute. I want to say that what Aware Week is about is having dialogue, and I do want you to encourage to share your comments and ask questions and engage in that dialogue tonight with Dr. Wilson and with each other here. Thank you. And please.
You've definitely painted a very complex picture, and showed us again, I guess, the fact that racism does pervade the entire society. Now, I was wondering, because it is so complex and resources are limited, where do we best target our resources in order to sort of affect a change now?
Some of the most important ways that you can deal with this circumstance does not require additional resources. I would suspect that there are not a great deal of resources going into the training of these people as race relations specialists. It's a matter of shifting current resources to those areas that we consider to be priorities. When we find in certain areas of priorities, it's amazing how we find money and resources to underwrite them. It's when they're not high priority that we can't find the resources. And I'm not saying that facetiously, because I'm suggesting that there are things that we're doing now that could be better done with just doing them in a different way. Let me give you an example. One of the things that is most frustrating for me is the lack of priority of effective teaching in the university. Okay, let me give you some figures. After 6 years of undergraduate study, I'm talking about the United States as a whole, the 3,400 colleges and universities in this country. After 6 years of undergraduate study, 51% of white students have earned an undergraduate degree, and 27% of black and Hispanic students have earned an undergraduate degree. We are the most inefficient industry in the country, but we make no connection between our distinguished professors and the effectiveness of teaching of undergraduate students. You know, if you had a kid in the 3rd grade and they were failing, you go right to school and talk to the teacher. We see no connection between university faculty and the quality of teaching in university. Otherwise, why would we allow such abysmal things to happen? However, the reward system in higher education pays little attention to effective teaching. And as a consequence, the success of undergraduate students in our liberal arts colleges and universities is practically ignored. And we are wasting huge amounts of talent in the country. Less than half of our undergraduates get through the system with a baccalaureate degree. Now, that doesn't mean that there is not effective teaching going on. And it ought to, it seems to me, energize the community to say, why are we wasting this talent when we're talking about being competitive internationally with the Pacific Rim countries and the soon-to-be united European community in 1992? And it seems to me if we're going to answer that question, then we need to address the fact that we are not efficiently turning out products in this, one of our major enterprises, the education of young people. So, are there some examples? There are some outstanding ones. Yuri Treisman at Berkeley, head of the Math and Science program, won the Charles Dana Foundation Award, who is related to some of the Danas around here, as I understand, for effective teaching. He established a program in which he reduced the failure rate in introductory calculus from 60% for minority students to 4%. Okay. He's been doing that for 10 years. You would think someone in the academy would be sufficiently interested to say, that's the way we ought to teach. Well, who cares? When you're rewarded for research and publications, and the most prestigious job in the university is when you don't have students at all. So, you see what I'm saying? Yeah, okay. And that didn't require a shift in resources. Yuri Treisman looked at students, first of all, assuming they are capable of learning. That's something that many of us in higher education don't assume. He assumed they were capable of learning, so that was not the question. The question is, why were they failing? Then he began to change the structure of the teaching learning process to improve the academic environment and the effectiveness of teaching. Didn't cost a dime. But he decreased the failure rate of, here were kids coming to Berkeley, obviously bright, as he assumed, or they wouldn't be there, and yet they were punching out in introductory calculus at 60%, which meant most of them that were going to scientific careers would never make it, because you can't do it without calculus. And he reduced that failure rate to 4%, which is nothing short of miraculous. And the current success of students in the math and science program at Berkeley, of minority kids, blacks and Hispanics, is equal to that of white and Asian students. At Mount St. Mary's in Los Angeles, where students are recruited with SAT scores of less than 800, right out of the East Los Angeles barrios. At Mount St. Mary's, they graduate 80% of their students with a baccalaureate degree, and most of them go on to graduate school. I'm saying that if we shift some priorities, they don't spend more money at Mount St. Mary's. They do like Winston Churchill says, blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Because they're committed to educating kids, and they're committing to seeing them get into the system. It does not require a lot of different resources. It requires difference of values, difference of priorities.
I have two questions. One, I'm doing some research on public housing, of which a large percent of black population resides in. And one of my initial findings is that as far as law enforcement is concerned, that the white police departments fail to enforce in the public housing developments, largely maybe due to a racial fear, and also that they use that public housing development as a disciplinary ground for their worst officers. I'd like to know if you could just talk about that a little bit. And the second question is your points about China. I believe over this summer or maybe late last year, there were a number of racial attacks against the African students taking classes in China, and if you could talk about that a little bit, or the present climate against towards African students now in China.
Let me talk about the last one first. I think one of the refreshing things that we learn about human nature is that there's nothing unique to one group, okay? Is that we're all xenophobic in our own setting. And that's basically the same with the Chinese. It's the same with Africans and African nations. if we could break down one of the great failings of human beings, and that is their own ethnocentrism and their xenophobia, we will have solved one of the great mysteries of human nature. But the fact of the matter is that did occur. I've talked to African students who studied in China, and talked to Chinese students who studied in the United States. And we see much of the expression of sometimes the worst sides of our nature in those circumstances. You must remember that China was a very closed society. From the time of the 49 revolution and the communists threw the Kuomintang out until Nixon went to China in 72, there was no contact between America and China. There was no contact with most of the African countries. After Nixon's visit, and I went to China the next year, the perception of their isolation from the world was just so evident. Now, when you compound that with the fact that they were basically a closed society before that, the expression of their insularity and their xenophobia was understandable, not excusable, but understandable. And as a consequence, it wasn't just Africans. All outsiders are considered aliens in that society, and are considered to be less than the Chinese. It's just in the culture. But what has begun to break that down, and the difference between 73, when I was there, and 89, was a profound difference because of the years of opening up that society to interaction with outsiders, and the kind of reception that was accorded by Chinese students, the hunger for knowledge about the outside world, the fact that many of the demonstrators in Tiananmen Square had studied here at Harvard, at the University of Michigan in my home state, at Ohio State University, and had come back with many of the things that they had learned here, and were then demanding those same things. It was a different kind of change from the way it had been when African students were coming to China. I think we have to respect the fact that it's a developmental process, and rather than excuse it, to say that it is growing and is changing. Now, obviously, the massacre of the students has set back the society considerably. You're having there the problem of attempting to grow economically and stay closed intellectually. It cannot happen. It just can't happen. It is just a matter of time before those contradictions are going to express themselves again. So I have really, despite the tragedy of June 4th, some great optimism that you're going to see just as much change in China as you see in Eastern Europe. On the police thing, I don't know if there are any easy answers to police problems in our major cities. I think that the situation of crime and drugs in some respects is out of control, and I don't know if giving any kind of glib answers will respond to that. Unless we can make more of a serious effort to deal with those issues than we are now, and I speak at both the national and the local level, we may very well find some of those communities are uninhabitable to human beings, quite frankly. And I don't say that to exaggerate. I spend at least 20 hours a week doing volunteer work with the homeless in Washington, D.C. And as beautiful a city as that is, and as nice as the part where I live, when you go to 14th and U in Washington, D.C., it is a foreign country. It is not a place that you need to be. It is not a place where human beings, whether they are police or not, need to be. And it seems to me if we're going to save our cities, we've got to do something much more drastic than what we're doing. And I don't have the answers. I wish I did.
I appreciate very much the suggestions that you've given for the climate with the students, working with the different backgrounds, and also towards the quality of teaching. What struck a note with me was when you mentioned about the subject matter, how it's being given from a European perspective. And having Dean Jewett here present, and you mentioning that President Derek Bach was the chairman of the board of the organization that you're with, I thought that this would be an excellent forum, perhaps for you to make suggestions as to what Harvard can do to improve its curriculum.
Well, as I mentioned to you earlier, Derek Bach was chairman of our board. He is no longer chair. The chairs rotate every year, and that was 4 years ago. But he is still very much involved in ACE activities, particularly on our President's Commission dealing with college athletics. I hope we can do something about that too, by the way. But with respect to curricular change, obviously that is an area that creates more heat than light. For example, we talk about the sacredness of the canon, and certainly a very traditional elite institution like this would be one where you would think that there would be this living flame where the books are gathered. Yet the fact of the matter is that the distribution of courses here in the general curriculum is just as crazy as it is anywhere else. And if we get so upset about diversifying the curriculum so that it reflects the ethnic and gender diversity of the world that we live in, I often wonder why people get upset when you look at Stanford and UCLA. You can get credit for your history distribution at UCLA by taking a course in the history of Los Angeles. I mean, you know, this is absurd. But that repeats itself over and over again. People are really protecting something that doesn't exist. And what we need to do is to be very candid and to indicate that we're protecting a set of values that we're talking about. And it's those values that certainly I would be one to say that there are documents that we ought to all know in common. And I would say there are a lot of others that we don't know that we ought to know. And, you know, one can make a very good case for our being able to have educated citizens who have learned from a variety of sources. But when I see the kinds of things that I see on various campuses in terms of the expressions of bigotry that come from many students, I don't feel that they have learned something that's so sacred that exemplifies itself in their behavior. There must be something better we can do than what we're doing now. And I think we ought to examine that. There is a whole chapter on curriculum reform in the Minorities on Campus handbook, and certainly it's something worth discussing by looking at that chapter. If you've had access to that document, I don't know. But as I say, the Graduate School of Education here ordered 300 copies, and evidently they're planning to use it in a serious fashion. Yes, ma'am. You're not too short. The microphone is too tall.
How do I get this off of here? You mentioned something
I can
about
hear you.
Drugs being a problem in our community when they're talking about the policing. And it's so ironic because I was thinking about it, and 75% of the people that abuse drugs in this country are Caucasian, and people are trying to label it a black problem. I think I've seen evidence where I know people in the police department where actually blacks, minority children are targeted for victims of drug abuse. Because the police actually go undercover and they actually sell the drugs. They control the drugs. When they make a drug bust, they take it in possession. And a lot of the police officers, if they make a big drug bust, they get like 1 kilo to themselves, and they can do whatever they want with it. And they go into our neighborhoods, and it just gets recycled, and they know where the stuff is. And there's a new law that was passed now. Anything obtained through drug money gets confiscated. So what happens is it's a cycle. They get the drugs, get the valuables, goes into the police compound, they take what they want. Drugs that are kept, they either use or they send it back into the community, and it keeps recycling. And I'm wondering what we as minorities can do about it. I mean, it's not just a black problem. Like I said, 75% of the people that do use drugs are white. It's not just about, and I know this firsthand. I know people in the department, and I know people who work in Suffolk Court or probation officers, so they know what's going on. It's destroying our youth.
Yeah, that's true, and you're quite right that it is not just a black problem, but proportionately in the black community it has more devastating effect.
Because we have less money.
Well, yes, obviously you have less money and less resources to deal with it, but I guess the point I'm making is that it's an American problem.
Yeah, I understand that, but I'm
Okay.
saying, what can we as black people do to put up a barrier against this abuse on our youth?
Well, one of the things that we can do, and that it is not easy to do, is to use the institutions in our community as major resources to address it. And by that I mean the churches, the schools, and those community institutions that at one time were able to coordinate community resources and use them effectively. Part of the problem, and I say this deliberately critically, is that often our religious institutions do not take part in the life of the community. I don't mean the spiritual life. Sunday is a great day. But Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, there's very little impact on the part of these institutions in the life of the community. And indeed, many of those institutions stand empty during those 6 days and have no effective life in the community. And this is not the first time that I have suggested that our churches, which have been and continue to be one of the major resources in the community, have got to take an active role in dealing not just with this issue of drugs, but other issues as well. The breakdown of family cohesion and the educational failures that are occurring. In fact, if we were to mobilize the church resources in the black community as educational institutions during the week to augment what does or does not go on in schools, we could perhaps create a revolution in the education of black children. And I say that critically because we don't do it. That is not to remove the responsibility of the larger society to deal effectively with funding inner city schools in major urban areas, but it is also to say that we have a responsibility in our community to do more than we're doing. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
All right.
I consider myself to be moderate, and so that means that I try to keep an open mind. And as you were saying in your talk, which, by the way, I enjoyed very much, not only did you say things, but you backed them up with facts, which is a refreshing thing to say nowadays, to see nowadays. I honestly thought that there was not, I knew there was a trouble with racism in this country, but the cold, hard facts that you were giving, which are undeniable, really surprised me and kind of woke me up to just how much of a problem it truly is. And I was wondering what is being done and what more can be done to get these facts out into the public consciousness, because this is not coming across on the 6 o'clock news, and it's not getting to your average American, whether or not they watch the 6 o'clock news. Somehow we've got to get this out to everyone in America in some palatable form.
Well, I think one of the surprising but also promising things is the kind of generation of concern that's being expressed almost across the spectrum by the business community. I just find that very ironic that while our intellectuals are, seeing how many theories can balance on the head of a pin, the business community, although I have some concerns about it, is looking at it strictly as a bottom line issue. They see, for example, that we are being outdistanced technologically by the Pacific Rim countries in a very real sense. For example, we manufacture no VCRs in this country, and everybody here, I would suspect, has got a VCR in their home or in their apartment. Okay, and they're moving far ahead in the next generation of chips and other kinds of things. And we see that. We see Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, and so forth as a very powerful economic force. The European Economic Community will have one currency in the next 3 years.
I'll believe it when I see it, but anyway.
Well, believe me, it's moving that way. I was.
It will certainly be a big economic force. Your point is well taken.
There's no question it will be a big economic force, and it will be one that we will have to contend with. When you look at the combined resources that will be there, 250 million people, a unified economy, and, fine. I think it's well to exercise skepticism, but they're certainly moving in that direction. When I was in Europe last summer, I went from London to Rome on a Euro pass. It's just like going from New York to Washington, D.C. on the shuttle. And believe me, it is becoming unified. So you have that. The business community is very clear. They say, hey, guys, we got to deal with that. And if we're going to deal with that, we can't have this economy going down the drain with undereducated people and people who are not employed. Just very clear. And so, I find that very refreshing. So it doesn't surprise me that the chairman of the New York Stock Exchange and the head of the Mead Corporation and what have you are saying, by God, we got to do something about it. I don't care if they're green, blue, yellow, or white. They got to be educated and they got to work. Okay? Now, that's fine. I get a little concerned about that because that's all that's being talked about. Okay? It's not talked about what kind of citizens will these people be and how will they relate to each other and to the rest of the world, or what kind of society we will have. It's talking strictly on economic issues. And I'm very pleased at the fact that they're out there speaking, and I think this report, when it comes out from the Business Higher Education Forum, will have some impact. The business community is going to get energized, and they're going to put money into the schools. The Mead Corporation is already gearing up to put $200 million into elementary and secondary schools, saying we've got to improve the education. So you have a number of companies that are willing to reinvest money because it's costing them right now. They spend $500 billion a year on educational programs independent of colleges, universities, and elementary and secondary schools. And a great deal of it is re-educating people that weren't educated in the schools in the first place. They are losing at the bottom line, and their mission is very clear. If we can get that same kind of energy in our educational sector and in our political leadership, we will begin to make some movement. Unfortunately, it's being motivated by a declining economy and by a fear of our place in the economic order. I wish, and I know this is very fanciful, that people would do it because it's right. But, why ask for too much?
Yes, I have a question regarding the regeneration of scholars, particularly scholars of color. And I'm presently a student at the Graduate School of Education here at Harvard. We have a dearth, to put it mildly, of people of color in the faculty, particularly in upper-level faculty positions. I believe we have 5 blacks, 1 Latino, no Asians, no American Indians. And I guess it's a matter of issues of intention versus effect. What are the actual results? And how do institutions such as Harvard and other institutions which embrace the liberal ideology forward their mission and include more faculty members from various backgrounds? And why institutions such as this are not farming some of its undergraduates as well as some of its graduate students into these positions? And what you see in terms of national issues in that regard.
A book that was just published last month dealing with the future prospects for faculty in the arts and humanities. Bill Bowen, the former president of Princeton and now the president of the Mellon Foundation, published this book to give some sense of what faculty will look like between now and the year 2010. And what he sees is not a precipitous, but a gradual decline in the faculty. And by the turn of the century, some 37% of the faculty will be lost in American colleges and universities. And there are not enough coming through the pipeline to fill those positions. If one is to consider one as parity, by about 2005, there will be 0.8 people for each faculty vacancy. That means that although now there are sufficient faculty competitive for positions, which gives less incentive for universities to go out and seek non-traditional faculty. Okay. Then the motivation now in looking at the huge gaps that will be lost, that will be out of the faculty between now and the end of the century, there is now more momentum gearing up, if Bill Boyne is correct, to do more recruitment and to do more production of doctoral students. What does this mean for people of color? It means that whereas in the 60s, when Lyndon Johnson signed the 1964 Civil Rights Act saying, if you do not recruit and hire and train, we will take your federal money away from you, that was when the generation of scholars was training that I am a part of. Okay, folks got that message, went out and snatched people off the street and said, here, get in the PhD program. And I mean that literally. The department chair called up, we'd like for you to come in and look for a PhD. And a whole lot of folks were brought into the academy that way. When we found out that that didn't have any punch to it, nobody lost any dollars as a consequence of the lack of enforcement of the Civil Rights Act, then it went down. In 1977, there were 1,213 black PhDs awarded by American universities. In 1987, there were 765. Okay.
There were 3 or 4 in mathematics.
4 in mathematics. 4 in
that
mathematics.
they know of.
5 in computer science. Yeah. Okay. I mean, the statistics are bloody. Nobody is really making any strenuous efforts to do anything because they have learned, certainly during this past 8 years, nobody in the federal establishment is going to beat up on you if you don't make any significant efforts to recruit. I'm suggesting, and I hate to take the long route to answer it, but I wanted to give it some context, is that there is now some fire under the academy that you're going to lose nearly 40% of your faculty between now and the turn of the century, and they ain't coming through the pipeline. Because pride is kept. Not only are blacks not coming through the pipeline, whites are not coming through the pipeline either. Okay? 41% of the doctorates in math are earned by American citizens. Okay? In American universities. 46% of the doctorates in engineering are earned by American citizens. Okay. There has been a decline in minorities. White males are not going into doctoral programs. Believe me, if we are going to talk about, and this is what the business people are saying, if we're going to talk about being competitive in science and technology, we are training more non-resident aliens than American citizens in the hard sciences. In math, in physics, and in engineering, all of them, Americans earn fewer doctorates than do non-resident aliens. If we don't see in our own self-interest that we've got to do that, and also bring people of color into that picture, we're in bad shape.
We can only take one more question, and then we really have to let Dr. Wilson take a rest for the day. It's been a long day, and he's also traveling tomorrow for another address. So the last question.
I appreciate your allowing me to ask this. You have very insightfully identified many areas in which racism occurs, and you have also identified ways in which the majority population needs to change in order to work to change the society. What I'm wondering is if you have a separate agenda or any ideas for ways the minority groups can work in order to further this change.
Yeah, I've mentioned in response to Sister's question earlier about some roles that minority organizations and institutions can play. Certainly I feel that the role of the churches has not been as full a one as they could play, and that there ought to be more done there. I would say the same thing for many of the schools in the Central City communities, that we ought to be talking in the New Yorks and Chicagos and Washington, D.C.s about year-round schools and talking about using those resources to the maximum rather than having them stand idle for 3 months of the year when nothing is going on and when kids are dumbing down, as it were, during the summers. There are many things that can be done. I don't hold it up as any great model, but certainly professionals can do more to work in community agencies to salvage much of the refuse, and that's the only term to describe it, that's being poured out in many minority communities. I'm talking about inner city communities, which are very desperately going down the drain. As I mentioned, I spend about half as much as the time I spend on the job I get paid for volunteering to work with the homeless. But if you've ever seen the circumstances of homeless people in Washington, D.C., and I know that it's worse here. I think as we were walking over tonight, we're talking about people sleeping in this kind of weather out here. At least 10 to 15 people each year die on the streets in Washington, D.C. from exposure. And just yesterday in the Washington Post, they indicated that about 20 shelters turned people away last night because there was not room for them. And you know, my doctorate's in psychology, and I've been working doing counseling and psychotherapy with homeless families and with children who've been living on the streets for 1 and 2 years. That's a very minor thing, but the fact of the matter is that in many of those community agencies, particularly the one in which I volunteer, all the volunteer staff is white. There are black professionals in the city of Washington that ought to be doing much of the same kind of thing. That if we use the resources, at least of the educated black middle class, there ought to be more of that kind of community resource used, and we don't see enough of it. Too many of my colleagues who are also licensed psychologists live out in the suburbs, and it ain't their problem. And quite frankly, I just find that reprehensible. But there is more that minority organizations, institutions, communities, and committed people can do. And the problem of generating that commitment is equally as difficult as generating commitment in the white community.
First, I want to thank both Dr. Wilson and Dean Jewett for giving introductory remarks that really set a context to think about AWARE, and Dr. Wilson for really presenting us from really unconvincing, very convincing material about ways to thinking about issues of racism in a college institution and as citizens of this society. So thank you both, Dr. Wilson and Dean Jewett. I also want to mention one more housekeeping thing before you go, two more housekeeping things. The AWARE Planning Committee is very interested in hearing from you about the AWARE forums during the week. If you don't have time, which I imagine you don't at this point, to fill the evaluations, please take time after today, fill them up and send us, drop them either at University Hall or by mail, or stop by and bring them. We want your input in order to build up on AWARE programs and to really do programming that is connected to the kind of concerns, questions, and needs that you as a community and we as a community have. So please take time to fill those evaluations. The second thing that I want to point out is that, as I said earlier, what AWARE Week is about in many ways is having dialogue about these very complex issues. I want to point out one particular event happening this week that I think is a particularly forum to continue to talk about the things that were raised tonight, and that is a brown bag lunch at Adams House Friday at noontime. It will be only an hour and a half brown bag lunch, and there's a whole lot of confusion about what brown bag lunch means. That means please bring your lunch and we will provide drinks and cookies. But do, if you're interested in continuing this discussion, please join us on Friday at noontime at Adams House Senior Common Room. Take programs with you, and I hope to see you all in other events, including the AWARE dance. I usually feel like the older only person there. Please join me so I don't feel alone. Thank you for being here tonight.